Well, we are going to talk about the French Revolution. The French Revolution at the end of the 18th century had many consequences which were common to all revolutions of the West at that time. The first of the general causes was the social structure of the West. It was a feudal regime which had weakened and disappeared in parts of Europe. Wealthy commoners, which were merchants, manufacturers, and professionals, aspired to political power in those countries which didn't have it. Many peasants owned their land and had improved their standard of living and education, and wanted to get rid of feudalism. There had been an increase in European population from 70-30, and France had become the most populated country of Europe.
A larger population created a greater demand for food and consumer goods. From about the year 1770, economic crises, provoking alarms and even revolts became frequent, leading to the advancement of arguments for social reform. Although the philosophies were certainly influenced by theorists such as Descartes, Spinoza, and Locke, they came to very different conclusions about political, social, and economic matters. Thus, a revolution seemed necessary to apply the ideas of Montesquieu, Voltaire, or Rousseau. This Enlightenment was spread among the educated classes by societies of thought, like Masonic lodges, agricultural societies, and reading rooms.
It is uncertain, however, whether a revolution would have come without the added presence of a political crisis, faded with the heavy expenditure that the wars of the 18th century entailed. The rulers of Europe sought to raise money by taxing the nobles and clergy, who in most countries had until now been exempt. To justify this, the rulers likewise invoked the arguments of advanced thinkers by adopting the role of enlightened despots. This provoked reaction throughout Europe from the privileged bodies, diets, and estates.
The Enlightenment was divided into three stages. The early Enlightenment from 1685 to 1730, the High Enlightenment from 1730 to 1780, and the Late Enlightenment and beyond from 1780 to 1815. The French Revolution of 1789 was the culmination of the High Enlightenment vision of throwing out the old authorities to remake society along rational lines, but it developed into bloody terror that showed the limits of its own idea. Now we are going to enumerate some causes of the French Revolution. The first one was the social inequality in France due to the state systems. There was a social order that determined your place in society, what you could do for living, and where you could live. The system was called the Ocean Regime or Order, and it divided the population of France into three states. The first state was the Roman Catholic Church, the second state was the French nobility, and the third state was everyone else in France, including merchants, lawyers, laborers, and peasants. They composed the 98% of the French population. They were excluded from position of honor and political power. The first and second states were very privileged. They had big houses and a lot of money. They didn't have to work and pay taxes. The peasants and the urban workers were very poor and lived on land owned by noblemen. They were not allowed to hunt for food, and sometimes they had to get the permission of the landlord to get married, or they chose whom they should marry. They couldn't leave the land they lived and worked without the permission from the landlord. They were part of a system called the feudal system. The bourgeoisie was not as poor as the masses. They were educated and talented. However, they were part of the third state, and they couldn't hold high position in the government, army, or the church.
Okay, I am going to talk about the second cause of the French Revolution, which was tax burden on the third estate. The first estate, or the clergy, owned a 10% of the land. They were wealthy and paid no taxes. The second estate, or the nobles, owned a 25% of the land. They didn't pay many taxes and were allowed to collect dues from peasants. The third estate, the merchants, the lawyers, and the peasants, for example, in contrast, was forced to pay taxes, and this burdened the third estate, and they began to question the unjust state system to which they belonged. They started to plan to overthrow it.
The third cause is related with the financial crisis caused due to costly wars. Throughout the 18th century, France participated in a series of expensive wars, primarily against its long-term rival, Great Britain. After the 7-Year War, Louis XIV tried to build a larger navy and an anti-British coalition of allies, which resulted in a mountain of debts and economic crisis.
The fourth cause were the poor harvests and the rising in the cost of bread. In 1784, a severe winter and extreme droughts in summer caused poor harvests and famine throughout Europe. France also experienced poor harvests in 1787 and 1788 due to extreme winters. These years of extreme weather conditions and poor harvests greatly affected the peasants who were already struggling to survive, and this frustration led them to revolt. This situation worsened when the poor harvests caused the price of flour to increase, which also increases the price of bread, making the working class spend almost 90% of their daily income on bread. This affected the common French citizens who resented the monarch for his not being able to solve the food crisis.
The last cause is related with Louis XV and XVI's failure to overcome the financial problems that France faced. This economic condition angered the masses, and they became critical of their king.
Now we are going to talk about the King Louis. The first Louis was Charlemagne's son, with his later namesakes Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and Louis XV. Absolutism reached a climax. Although Louis XVI made attempts at reform, the French Revolution broke out during his reign, and he was executed by the revolutionaries in 1793. Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, reigned for more than 70 years, inheriting the throne when he was only 5 years old, although he wasn't in control of the state. Absolute monarchy reached its ultimate height during this time, and he was known for his lavish life. The country was left in great debt due to the wars with other European countries, and later became a huge financial crisis during the reign of his two successors.
When the King Louis XVI wanted money, he just increased the taxes of the third estate. In the 1780s, the king had financial troubles and wanted to solve this by taxing the first and second estates, whom were resisting this. At that time, only the States General, which was an official meeting called by the king with representatives from all the states, could vote and decide on raising taxes. For 175 years, no king had done this because they didn't want to give the people any say in the governance of the country. However, Louis XVI was forced to call a meeting of the States General. The bourgeoisie representing the third estate wanted the same right as the second estate, and when they realized that was impossible, they broke away and formed a young group called the National Assembly. Their goal was to draw up a constitution for France in which the third estate could also have voting rights.
Now we will talk about the storming of the Bastille. When the National Assembly was formed, the third estate hoped it would hoped it would change the old order and improve their own lives. On July the 14th, 1789, hundreds of urban workers from Paris stormed the fortress and prison that was called the Bastille. They thought the fortress was full of weapons and they wanted to arm themselves. The fortress was a symbol of the old order, and when the masses captured it, it signified its end.
Okay. Now we are going to talk about the stages of the revolution. As we know now, the French Revolution was a fight for freedom and for equality of all people in France. The motto of the revolutionaries was liberty, equality, and fraternity. The events of the revolution occurred over 10 years, and these can be divided into 3 stages. The first stage of the revolution was a moderate stage with not much violence and not many big changes achieved. It took part from 1789 to 1791. This first stage started when the urban masses stormed the Bastille. Some soldiers who were guarding the Bastille joined them and released the prisoners. Once the peasants heard what was happening in Paris, joined the revolution. They burned the houses of their landlords and destroyed the feudal registers. The feudal registers were the only proof on paper of the feudal relationship between the peasants and their landlords. On the 26th of August 1789, the National Assembly started to create a constitution by writing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This contained liberal ideas and how people should be ruled. As the king was the ruler, he had to accept this declaration, but he didn't want to do it, so all angry masses marched to Versailles. As a consequence, the king accepted the declaration, and many nobles had already given up their feudal rights. Those who refused to do so started to flee the country.
The first stage ended in 1791 when the National Assembly was in power. They made some changes. For example, the second stage lost their special privilege. Basic human rights like liberty and equality were accepted. The church lost its special privilege. Tithes were stopped and church land was taken and sold. The king lost his absolute power and everybody became equal before the law. All men above 25 could get voting rights, but they had to earn a certain amount of money before they could get these rights.
The radical stage began in 1792 and lasted until 1794. The second stage was, as the name suggests, more radical, with changes taking place and a lot of violence. Anyone who didn't support the government was killed. The bourgeoisie wanted the revolution to end with them in power as they replaced the aristocracy and dominated the peasants. France didn't have a monarch anymore and became a republic, as in January 1793 the king was killed at the guillotine. A new group came into power, the Jacobins. They came from the masses and wrote a new constitution, where all men over 25 will have voting rights. They also used violence to stay in power and kill those who didn't support or agree with them, and their rule became known as the Reign of Terror, as they killed the aristocracy in big public displays to inflict fear into their enemies. The leader of the Jacobins was Maximilien Robespierre, who was killed by his own friends in 1794 due to them having had enough of his terror and violence.
The third and last stage was again moderate, much like the first stage. The members of the bourgeoisie were in power, and their government was called the Directorate. They drew up another constitution, one that reinstated the qualifications for voting rights that were in the first constitution. During the last phase, foreign armies were still a threat. The generals became more powerful and gained more influence within the country. French armies, especially those led by young General Napoleon Bonaparte, were making progress in nearly every direction. After his arrival in Paris, he led a coup against the Directory, eventually stepping up and naming himself first consul.
With Napoleon at the helm, the revolution ended, and France entered a 15-year period of military rule.